Thank you so much for the opportunity to bring a word today. It's something that I don't take lightly. And I love to preach for this community because it's home and it's the place where I can push into the edges of my thinking. Um, so, will you pray with me? God, I just want to offer this time up to you. I thank you for each and every one of these people, every one of whom is your beloved, the apple of your eye. God, I ask that you take this little offering toward whatever it is that you are doing in the world that we can just barely begin to perceive. Take this offering and make of it what it needs to be. Cause each of us to hear the words that we need to take the next steps that you are leading us in. We pray this in the name of the one who came as a tiny baby and is also a blazing force of power for love and transformation in the world. Amen. So, I know that a lot of you have heard me talk, and many of you know and have a relationship with yourselves with the Homefulness Project and Poor Magazine. But I found myself this week as I sat with these passages thinking about People School, which happens twice a year. And they wanted me to let you know it's happening in January if you're interested. And it's a time when a group of people calling themselves poverty scholars offer teaching to those of us with some form of race, class, or educational privilege. And it really, really affected me when I went through it. The first day of People School consists of a number of theater pieces about the lives of people living in poverty, enacted by people who are currently poor, and most of whom either are currently or have been without housing at some time. And then the actors lead us, the students, in discussions about the scenes. And then the second day, traditionally, is led entirely by Tiny Gray Garcia and focuses on our stories, the stories of those of us with race, class, or educational privilege, on the ways that we have been shaped by Western settler colonial assumptions and how those then dovetail with gentrification in the Bay Area and the growing houselessness in Oakland. And one of those assumptions includes the idea that growing up means moving away from our family home, and in particular, separating emotionally and geographically from our mothers. And Tiny is, those of you who know her know this, Tiny is very upfront in suggesting that people who are a gentrifying presence here in the Bay consider going home to live with their or our families. And I knew about this focus going in, and still it was really challenging to me when it came up. Because on the one hand, as a queer person who grew up in a very homophobic context, leaving home was an act of self-care and maybe even survival. I believe that. On the other hand, there was something about what Tiny was sharing that nagged at me and still has not let me go. It touched some kind of unsettled place in me. As homework for follow-up sessions, Tiny assigned a number of films for us to watch on this theme, including a wrenching documentary called Daughter of Da Nang. I don't know if any of you know it. I should probably give a trigger warning here for international and transracial adoption of children from countries affected by US imperialism. It feels like a really important story to honor, and I recognize that there is so much pain here. So Daughter of Da Nang follows Heidi, who was born during the Vietnam War, the child of a Vietnamese woman and an American soldier. Out of fear for the safety of her biracial child and in the hopes that she would have a better life, Heidi's birth mother sent her to the United States as part of Operation Baby Lift. Yes, it was really called that. And Heidi was adopted by a white evangelical Christian family and raised to think of herself as a white American. As an adult, Heidi sets out to find her birth mother, who, it turns out, is also trying to find her. At this point, the documentary filmmaker gets involved and arranges for Heidi, who is now married and has 2 children of her own, to fly to Vietnam to meet her birth family. And at this point, we are hoping for a happy reunion story, right? And there are a few minutes of that. The whole family turns out to meet Heidi at the airport, and they show her around the place where she was born. But then what quickly becomes evident is what reviewers of the film call a culture clash. And maybe that's what it is. Heidi's birth mom, Mai T, wants Heidi to show up in that relationship in a way that Heidi just can't. Mai T wants to be physically close to her, even wants to sleep with her. And we watch Heidi squirm with discomfort. Then, a few days into the visit, the family asks Heidi to take her mother back with her to the United States. Or if that can't happen, to send money back to Vietnam to cover her mom's living expenses. There is a shocked silence, and Heidi storms out of the room. She is angry and feels used by these people, as if the family just wants her money. She pulls away, flies back home, and never answers any of the letters her mother or brother continue to send. The grief in this film will not let go of me. Of course, I will never know what it is like to be either of the 2 women in this story, Heidi or her mom. Their stories are sacred and their own, and I have nothing to say about Heidi's decision. These are not individual matters. That's why I also can't hold this story as separate from me or Heidi as an unrelated stranger. I can't hold this situation at a distance. As a documented American citizen, I am implicated in this story. Heidi's is a story about exile. It's a story about the ways that powerful entities take human beings captive, sometimes by force, think the transatlantic slave trade or California missions, sometimes through economic pressure, think trade policies driving migration, and sometimes through seduction, the promise of a better or safer life, think just about all of us. This is exile, and exile is the context into which the prophet Isaiah speaks. A large swath of the Judean people have been taken by the conquering Babylonians into exile within Babylon, and they have lived there for about 50 years at this point. They have married and had children there, and many have even grown wealthy through their assimilation. And yet, some part of them, we're told, has never forgotten their beloved sacred land, home of their ancestors and their God. I don't know whether they have been able to forget the people left behind. See, not everyone was taken into exile. The Babylonians took the ruling class, the religious leaders, and the skilled artisans, but they left the peasantry behind in Judah, ostensibly without leadership, although I quibble with biblical historians about that, because wherever there are people, there is always organic leadership. But in any case, left them behind with no resources that they needed for subsistence. Now, this story of Babylonian exile that comes up in the reading this week has explosive resonance for our context right now. The history of this country, and not just this country, but pretty much any country with imperial aims and successes, is the history of removing people from their sacred land by force of violence or through economic necessity, profiting from this displacement, attempting to sever people from their spiritual sustenance, and breaking the connections that would bind people together in mutual care. That's how empire works. This is why Nigerian poet, philosopher Bayo Okomolafe speaks of paths to citizenship and inclusion of immigrants, even though they are in some ways good things and necessary, as acts of violence. There is always an amputation that accompanies acceptance. How many of us have cut off parts of ourselves in exchange for acceptance? There is always an injury that accompanies inclusion into the dominant culture. I want to suggest that this is true even for those of us who are fully a part of the coalition called whiteness. We receive far more benefits from the bargain. Hear me on that. I'm not trying to make false equivalencies, but there was somewhere along the line an amputation from our ethnicity, our ancestors who were once indigenous to some place, and the land that sustained those ancestors. Maybe we have almost forgotten the pain of it, buried it in newfound access to wealth and possessions and other privileges. But there is a part of us that knows and is bereft. In essence, living in the midst of this empire and assimilating to it, we are, most if not all of us, in exile. Without conscious effort to move towards spiritual connection, we are spiritually adrift. And this is not just a political reality. I know I'm talking about wars and official policies. It affects us intimately. Our capacity for joy and self-assurance and relationship are all compromised. This is exile, and we are in it. And this is the context into which the prophet Isaiah speaks comfort this week. It is also the context into which John the Baptist speaks his own kind of comfort, which he might call the opportunity for repentance. He addresses a people who have been colonized and might be tempted or have already succumbed to collusion with Rome in order to survive. And he invites them into something else. We are being invited into something else. Both Isaiah and John are offering the people a way to return home, to come back from exile. Isaiah proclaims, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." What this means is that the exiles are going home. The highway leads from Babylon, the prosperous empire into which they were resettled and in which they are now embedded, back to Judah, the decimated and impoverished, but nevertheless profoundly sacred homeland from which they were uprooted. And I'm going off script now, but I just have this image of God just blazing a path in the desert for God's people to go home. I think John is doing something similar. He's inviting people colonized by Rome to come out of the cities, the centers of imperial control, into the wilderness and into the Jordan River, the river that the people had crossed all those centuries ago at the end of their journey out of slavery in Egypt, that other empire. John's baptism is super symbolic and carries the power of a history that is in people's bones, the Jordan River. This Jordan baptism is designed to cleanse people of the worldview of empire and allow them to cross the Jordan again and re-enter the promised land anew. They are going home. So my question for us, First Congo, is what would it mean for us to go home? From all our various social locations, to move in the direction of our longing and to reconnect with land, with ancestors, with our spiritual groundedness and power. There are these couple of lines in the Isaiah passage that strike me as offering a partial answer to what that might mean, what it would require of us. They come right after the highway for our God that is being made through the wilderness. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. There's this regrading of the landscape that's happening here, right? A leveling of the terrain that leads from the opulent wealth of Babylon to the destitute poverty of Judah. The barriers of inequality must be demolished. The infrastructure of the community must be rebuilt to serve those who had been left behind. And that is how all people will see the glory of God together. No longer will the wealthy repose in box seats while the poor, the disabled, the disregarded are shut out of the arena altogether. It's this redistribution of wealth and access that allows the exiles to go back home. They have to redistribute some of what they might have gained in Babylon in order to return to the promised land. This is reparations and amends making. Even though the exiles were not at fault, right? And they have also suffered. It's not about assigning blame or metering out penance, but about entering into a way of mutual care where all thriving is everyone's responsibility. And so I wonder, are we ready to go home? Are we ready to enter back into relationship with our people? However we want to think about our people? Even if we can't yet reconnect with our immediate family, and there may be too much damage there, are we willing to reach for our ancestors, those who were indigenous somewhere and knew how to live in relationship with sacred land? One of the practices that I have adopted lately is to do a daily land acknowledgement as part of my prayer in the morning. Most of you know I sit outside in the yard. And I'm trying to notice my default assumption that the land is just dirt, inert, a dead thing. And to relearn that the land is alive and in relationship with me and us and the people who have cared for it for millennia. And for us to experience the glory of God together, we must redistribute access and resources, give back what has been stolen. So one of my questions is, can we let ourselves feel the wounds of exile that we have so long avoided? I think that's what happened for me at People School. What unsettled me for good about that and about Daughter of Danang. Are we willing to acknowledge the ways that life under empire has torn us, not just Heidi in the movie, but us, out of relationship, especially with those who were considered without value and have been left behind? What would it take for us to enter back humbly into relationship, honest relationship based in mutual care, when to do so requires the redistribution of resources and the demolition of power inequities? I've been thinking a lot, honestly, about our building. It is our largest and really these days probably our only significant financial asset. I wonder, is there some way for us to use that asset, which sits on stolen land and no doubt was financed in ways that relied on extraction from people who were already destitute, because that is how everything is financed, to come back into relationship with people who have been systematically abandoned, not because we feel guilty or are personally to blame, but because we want to go home. So I have ideas, but it's not up to me. And all that is ahead of where we are at this point. I don't actually think we can set ourselves free from exile, even with the help of my excellent ideas. Only God can do that, speaking into and through our community as a whole. The Babylonian exiles were sent home for real because the Babylonian Empire fell to Persia, and the new king just didn't have a taste for exiles. Sometimes I wonder if COVID-19 is our Persia, weakening our Babylon and creating our opportunity to set out. But it is ultimately not us, but God, who will blaze that highway that leads us home. For now, for this Advent, this waiting time, perhaps it is enough to let ourselves feel the longing, to align ourselves with captive Israel who mourns in lonely exile here, as the song goes, as we await God's saving moment. But let's be looking out for it. Let's not miss it. Let's be readying ourselves, praying for willingness, setting right our relationships with one another, gathering ourselves for a wilderness journey, and loosening our grip on the spoils of Babylon as we allow ourselves to pine for all that we have lost. First Congo, are you ready to go home? Amen.
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 Beautiful.
Yes, beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
You're ready.
Amen.